May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Well, I think Derek is right. I think this is the first time these four congregations have celebrated Holy Cross Day together. So this is pretty fabulous. So glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. This morning, my daughter asked me where I was going tonight, and I said, I'm going to celebrate the Feast of the Holy Cross. And she said, what is that? Which just goes to show that clergy children sometimes are not as well Sunday schooled as you might think. But as I explained to her, Holy Cross Day is the day that we remember and celebrate the cross of Christ. And this feast day began in the year 335, when the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is believed to be built on the place where Jesus died, was dedicated by the Emperor Constantine. In the excavation that was done for that church to be built, Constantine's mother, Helena, claimed to have found the true cross, the actual wooden cross that Jesus died on. Historically, that part's a little fuzzy, but it is a nice legend. Celebrating the cross might seem a little weird. To some folks, it does feel weird to have an instrument of execution be the symbol of our religion. Sometimes, maybe we'd rather it were something else. I actually had a seminary professor who suggested we go with the loaves and the fishes instead. She thought maybe we should focus on the life of Jesus rather than his death. Maybe that would be easier, but I don't think it would be as true. It wouldn't get to the heart of things in quite the same way. The cross says something about the nature of humanity, about ultimate, important things like love and suffering and forgiveness and grace that we just can't convey any other way. I get what my professor was saying. She wanted to focus on the positive and not get into sticky issues like betrayal and sin and injustice. But no matter how much we may want to ignore it, there is something wrong. We can't always see exactly what it is. We can't always see it straight on. Sometimes we just catch sight of it out of the corner of our eye. Another shooting in the news. Someone sleeping in a doorway. A fight with our spouse about something that's not really their fault. But it's hard to look at straight. So we turn away or hide our discomfort in an intellectual discussion about economic inequality that doesn't actually require us to change our behavior in any way. Or we remind ourselves it really was our spouse's fault after all. What is the thing that is wrong? Is it our distance from each other? Is it our tendency to fill up the empty places in our hearts with things that are not satisfying? Is it the way that human beings tend to blame their problems on those who are most vulnerable or most different from us? Is it our lack of love and respect for our own selves as children of God? Is it maybe that God-shaped vacuum in our hearts, as St. Augustine put it? When we look at the cross, we know that all of those things are really one thing. They're all connected to each other. And it's hard to put into words what the cross means to us. How for us it symbolizes not the existence of those wrong things, but a divine power over them, a reassurance that they will never, never have the last word, that God will not abandon us to ourselves. Over the centuries, countless explanations and rationalizations, academic and popular understandings of the meaning of the cross have been put forth. But no matter what the books or scholars say, what matters most is what it means to us in our lives, how we make sense of it or don't make sense of it, but just know that we stand in relationship to it somehow. that somehow in ways we can try to explain but never really pin down, it's transformative. It changes wrong things into right things. It changes human sin and injustice into something else, into something useful and good and salvific. All of these explanations share one core thing. The story of the cross is the story of how God transforms suffering into grace. In my own journey of trying to understand all this better, I read a book by Serene Jones. She's a theologian. She's the president of Union Seminary. But she does her theologizing in the real world. She writes about the women she had met through a self-defense class that she took at a city church, maybe a church like ours. Women who had all had a difficult experience that led them to want to take a self-defense class, many of them tragic or traumatic. Perhaps it was an incident in their lives where they were assaulted or attacked. In some cases, it was a relationship that was abusive. They all had a story to tell. And to Jones's surprise, they all loved the story of the cross. Despite their own experiences, they found healing and comfort and meaning in the cross. But they all understood it differently. For one, it made her feel that Jesus took the weight of the blows of her attacker that were aimed at her. For another, it meant the strong and powerful Jesus who stood up to Pilate would make short work of her ex-spouse. Each one interpreted the cross in the light of her own history, her own life, her own story. What's your story? Where is the suffering or the brokenness in your life? Where are you experiencing pain? Hold it up to the cross. See how the stories are the same, and see how they're also different and also the same. God knows your story. It's part of God's story too. The story of God is a story of love. God's love is displayed to us decisively on the cross. Jesus means to fix what's wrong and wants to bridge the gap of alienation from God and from each other and from ourselves. Jesus wants us to see that there is another way forward that is not blame and not violence, that there is a way to justice and peace. And to do this, to show this, he opens his arms wide upon the cross in that saving embrace, which is for all people, for you and for me. Serene Jones writes, in our personal lives, we go back to the cross time and again, sometimes seeking solace, sometimes justification, sometimes just simple comprehension, yet each time hoping that in it we will find sense to our living. And yet, at the end of the day, we confess that the truth to which this horrific, fascinating event bears witness remains true, even if we never hear it or believe it or find any meaning in its mysterious disclosure. She concludes that the truth is merely this: grace is grace. It comes. The way in which God approaches us most closely is not a way of judgment. God doesn't stand on a pedestal, doesn't stand as righteous against the unrighteous, but as Karl Barth puts it, enters right into us, enters deeper into life than any of us. There is no depth to which we may not descend, no struggle that we may endure, no failure that we may encounter, where we may not say, at that point, Christ groans and struggles with God, but he carried life into the midst of death. In the cross, Jesus changes death into life, transforms suffering into grace, and brings us to the loving heart of God. And that is very worth celebrating. Amen.